My parents stopped paying for my insulin so my sister could have the best wedding. When I was 9, my sister Vanessa got her first modeling gig, and my parents threw a party with champagne for 100 guests. That same month, I placed third in regionals for math and had to walk home in the rain because they forgot to pick me up. My teacher found me crying in the parking lot an hour after everyone left. That's when I learned where I ranked. Vanessa was the daughter they'd dreamed about, stunning and photogenic and effortless. I was the accident they'd had hoping for a son, the one who got type 1 diabetes at 6 and became expensive. Mom kept leather-bound albums of every magazine Vanessa appeared in. My medical records lived in a cardboard box in the garage next to the trash bins. By 12, I was managing my diabetes completely alone, because asking for help meant listening to them complain about test strip costs, while Vanessa's headshots ran 300 per session. I taught myself to calculate insulin doses, monitor my blood sugar, recognize the signs of highs and lows. My endocrinologist called me remarkably mature. Really, I just knew nobody was watching close enough to catch my mistakes before they killed me. At 14, I got into Berkeley's gifted math program, full scholarship, 6 weeks that could change everything. Mom glanced at the acceptance letter for 3 seconds before saying Vanessa had Fashion Week that month and they couldn't miss it. The program said I could take a bus. Dad refused, calling it dangerous. So I watched the opportunity disappear while Vanessa got 2 weeks in Manhattan with both parents attending every show. I started working at 15, lying about my age at a coffee shop where the manager didn't check too carefully. Every dollar went into a secret savings account for college because I knew they'd never help me. Vanessa had a $60,000 college fund Dad bragged about at dinners. When relatives asked about my plans, Mom would smile tightly and say I'd get scholarships since I was the smart one. Like my brain should pay for itself while Vanessa's face deserved investment. Then at 17, everything broke. I started feeling wrong in ways that went beyond normal diabetes symptoms. Exhausted constantly, nauseous randomly, vision blurring even with perfect glucose control. I ignored it for 2 months because complaining in my family meant being called dramatic. When I collapsed at work and woke up in the ER, the doctor's face went pale looking at my results. Kidney failure. Years of slightly imperfect diabetes management had accumulated into organ damage, and now I needed dialysis to survive. For exactly 3 months, I had real parents. Mom cried actual tears during my first dialysis session, staying all 4 hours even though she'd never attended a single endocrinologist appointment before. Dad took time off work, asked detailed questions, took notes like Vanessa's modeling meetings. They brought flowers and magazines and suddenly acted like losing me would hurt them. My nephrologist said with consistent treatment, my kidneys were improving, that I might avoid transplant completely if we maintained this care level. For the first time in 17 years, I let myself believe they actually loved me. Then Vanessa got engaged to Parker. The engagement party had 200 guests and cost more than my entire year of medical care. Mom spent weeks planning it while I calculated insulin doses alone again. 3 weeks after that party, she sat on my bed with her fake concerned face and said we needed to talk about treatment costs. She explained they'd been reviewing finances and my dialysis was more expensive than expected. Then she said Vanessa's wedding would cost $80,000 because she deserved a perfect day after working so hard on her modeling career. Mom used the word temporary 6 times while explaining they'd reduce my dialysis from 3 sessions weekly to 1, just until after the wedding. My kidneys had been improving anyway, she said, so maybe I didn't need as much treatment. I'd been at the appointment when they called my nephrologist. I'd heard him explicitly warn that reducing frequency would cause my kidney function to crash, possibly permanently. But Mom was reframing his medical warnings as approval, twisting his words into permission to prioritize Vanessa's wedding over my organs. She said they'd restart full treatment after the wedding in 6 months. Like my kidneys could just pause their decline for flower arrangements and photographers. Then she told me I needed to be supportive during this exciting time for Vanessa. That family means making sacrifices. She actually used that word, sacrifice. Like my kidney failure was a reasonable price for my sister's Instagram perfect celebration. I waited until she left, then grabbed my phone with shaking hands and searched medical emancipation minor. The results showed teenagers who'd fought for healthcare when parents made dangerous decisions. Actual legal cases, real precedent. I took screenshots of everything, saving articles about kids who'd won the right to their own medical care. My coffee shop manager found me 3 hours later surrounded by printed papers, crying so hard I couldn't breathe. She called her sister, who was a social worker, put her on speaker right there in the break room. The social worker's name was Patricia, and she told me to go to my next dialysis and speak to the patient advocate immediately. She explained that dialysis centers have protocols for medical neglect because treatment interruption can be deadly. She warned this would activate systems I couldn't control, that my parents would know I'd reported them, that there was no going back. I thought about 6 months of inadequate dialysis while Vanessa picked centerpieces. I told Patricia I was ready to fight because the alternative was dying quietly. At my Friday dialysis session, I requested a private meeting with the patient advocate James before treatment started. I explained everything in chronological order: the lifetime of neglect, the kidney failure, the 3 months of actual care, Mom's announcement about reducing treatment for wedding funding. James took notes on a yellow legal pad, his face getting darker with each detail. He made several calls using terms like vulnerable patient and financial exploitation. Within an hour, I was in a conference room with James, Dr. Okoye, my nephrologist, the clinic director, and the hospital's social work supervisor. Dr. Okoye stated clearly that reducing my dialysis to once weekly would cause rapid kidney decline, potentially complete failure requiring transplant or resulting in death. The clinic director explained they had legal obligations to report suspected medical neglect. The social work supervisor laid out my options, explaining I could request emergency court intervention, that they had documentation of my parents' plan, that this met the legal definition of neglect regardless of financial reasoning. That night at dinner, I acted completely normal while Vanessa showed fabric samples for bridesmaid dresses and Mom discussed catering chocolate fountains. I smiled and pretended to care, knowing the hospital was already filing reports that would explode everything within days. After dinner, I photographed all my medical records, my dialysis schedules, the bills, creating evidence that I understood my condition and the consequences of their choice. Vanessa came to my room around 10, dropping onto my bed with her phone showing Pinterest wedding boards. She asked my opinion on roses versus peonies, completely oblivious. She noticed me staring and laughed, asking if I was excited about being her bridesmaid. The question was so absurd I almost told her everything. Almost explained I might not survive to see her wedding if our parents' plan went forward. Instead, I said I was tired from dialysis. She nodded sympathetically before launching into stress about choosing between two photographers, genuinely believing her photography dilemma compared to my fight for survival. The hospital filed an emergency petition Monday morning. James called during my lunch period saying a judge had expedited the hearing for Wednesday because this involved immediate health risk. I'd have to testify. My parents would have their own lawyer. When I got home that afternoon, both parents were waiting with papers scattered everywhere and faces that made my chest hurt. Mom's voice shook, asking how I could do this to them, how I could accuse them of neglect when they'd paid for my care for months. She made it sound like I'd reported them for abuse instead of for planning to reduce my life-sustaining treatment for a party. Dad went straight to accusations that hospital staff was manipulating me, that I was too young to understand adult financial realities. Neither acknowledged the actual issue, that they'd chosen Vanessa's wedding over my kidneys. Instead, they reframed everything as me being ungrateful, manipulated, dramatic. The gaslighting was so intense I started doubting myself even though I had documented proof. Vanessa came home during the argument with shopping bags from her dress fitting. Mom broke down sobbing, explaining I was taking them to court and destroying the family right before Vanessa's wedding. No mention of the medical neglect they'd planned, just me as villain attacking for no reason. Vanessa turned to me and asked if this was really about her wedding, if I was trying to ruin her special day out of jealousy. The accusation left me speechless because this wasn't jealousy. This was survival. But Vanessa had lived her whole life believing she was the universe's center, so of course she'd interpret my fight to live as attacking her happiness. I tried explaining about the dialysis reduction, what it meant medically, but she interrupted saying Mom told her doctors said I could handle less treatment, that I was exaggerating for attention. Mom had been lying to Vanessa too, feeding her a version where my medical needs were optional and my fear was performance. Vanessa genuinely believed I was manufacturing crisis to steal her spotlight. I showed her Dr. Okoye's written opinion stating that reducing dialysis would likely cause kidney failure. She barely glanced at it before saying, doctors always exaggerate legally. She'd absorbed our parents' dismissal completely. The sister I'd grown up with looked at me like a stranger trying to hurt her. She said I was selfish, that if I needed more treatment I should pay for it myself instead of expecting our parents to fund everything. The irony of her saying this while planning an $80,000 wedding they were funding was so thick I couldn't breathe. That night, Vanessa posted on Instagram about family drama threatening to ruin her special day, asking for prayers. She didn't mention what the drama actually was, didn't explain her wedding was funded by money redirected from my life-saving treatment, just framed herself as victim of unnamed conflict. I watched supportive comments pile up while lying in bed, feeling more alone than ever. At least before, I'd fantasized maybe Vanessa was oblivious. Now I knew she'd been told exactly what was happening and chose to believe I was lying for attention. The Wednesday hearing happened in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and fear. I sat with James and a legal aid attorney named Olivia, who'd taken my case pro bono. My parents sat across the aisle with their expensive lawyer. The judge reviewed files forever before asking my parents' attorney to explain their position. She argued parental rights and financial hardship, claiming they were making reasonable budget decisions, balancing competing needs. She made it sound almost reasonable, like choosing between wedding funding and dialysis was normal, impossible choice rather than medical necessity versus luxury. Then Olivia presented Dr. Okoye's opinion, reading sections that made consequences impossible to ignore. She explained my kidney function improved specifically because of thrice-weekly dialysis, that reducing to once weekly wasn't minor adjustment but dangerous reduction causing almost certain rapid decline. She showed financial breakdown proving my parents had $60,000 in Vanessa's college fund redirected to wedding costs, $12,000 on the engagement party alone. The issue wasn't inability to pay but choice to prioritize celebration over health. Olivia entered my medical records showing 11 years of diabetes management performed almost entirely without parental supervision, my work records proving I'd supported myself since 15, teacher testimony documenting parental absence from my academic and medical life. She built a case not just about dialysis but systematic neglect existing long before my kidneys failed, showing this wasn't one difficult choice but culmination of 17 years treating me as less important. My parents' lawyer tried arguing all those examples were normal parenting, that teenagers managing health conditions builds character. She claimed my parents attended important appointments, ignoring they'd missed 90% until my crisis made it impossible to ignore. The judge stopped her mid-sentence and asked directly whether my parents planned to reduce my dialysis from 3 times to once weekly. The lawyer confirmed yes, trying to explain financial reasoning, but the judge cut her off. She said she didn't need to hear about wedding costs. She needed to know whether medical professionals recommended this reduction. The lawyer admitted they did not, that Dr. Okoye advised against it, but claimed parents had rights to make medical decisions even when doctors disagreed. Then I testified, walking forward with shaking legs, swearing to tell truth while my parents watched with expressions ranging from betrayed to furious. Olivia asked simple questions about my medical history, current treatment, what my parents told me about reducing dialysis. I answered factually, keeping my voice steady, even wanting to cry. Explaining Mom said my kidneys were improving, so I probably didn't need as much treatment. They needed money for Vanessa's wedding. It would be temporary until after the wedding in 6 months. I testified Dr. Okoye never said I could safely reduce treatment, that my parents reframed his warnings as approval, that I was terrified what would happen to my kidneys with only one session weekly for half a year. Olivia asked if I believed my parents loved me. I paused because the answer was complicated. I said I thought they loved the idea of me, but they'd spent my entire life showing I mattered less than Vanessa, that this dialysis decision was just the most extreme example of a pattern existing since childhood. The judge called recess and returned 30 minutes later with a ruling. She granted temporary emergency medical guardianship to the hospital, removing my parents' authority over health care until a full hearing in 6 weeks. She ordered them to continue paying insurance but removed ability to reduce or modify my treatment without Dr. Okoye's approval and court oversight. She stated clearly that while financial stress was real, denying necessary medical care to fund discretionary expenses like weddings constituted neglect regardless of intention. She said she'd seen the evidence and couldn't allow a child's kidneys to fail while parents spent $80,000 on a party, that weddings were celebrations while dialysis was survival, and no reasonable person would consider these equivalent. She ordered my parents to work with hospital social work establishing payment plans, warning that failure to comply would result in CPS investigation. My parents sat frozen, looking shocked the judge sided so completely with me. Walking out, I felt simultaneously victorious and destroyed because I'd won the right to medical care but lost any remaining illusion my parents loved me equally. That night, I lay in bed listening to them argue through walls, Mom crying that I'd ruined everything, Dad saying they should have expected this, that I'd always been difficult and ungrateful. Neither said they were wrong for planning to reduce my dialysis. They were just angry I'd fought back instead of accepting my assigned role as disposable child. Vanessa came to my room next morning, standing in the doorway like afraid to come closer. She said Mom told her what happened, that the judge gave hospital control, that our parents were devastated and humiliated. She wanted to know if I was happy now, if destroying the family felt good, if I understood her wedding was ruined because everyone would talk about my court case instead of her celebration. I stared at my sister and tried remembering when I'd last felt connected to her, like we were siblings rather than strangers competing for scraps. I couldn't find a single memory where she'd chosen me over herself, so I told her calmly that her wedding wasn't ruined. She could have whatever celebration she wanted, but it wouldn't be funded by money redirected from my dialysis. I explained our parents had planned to reduce my life-sustaining treatment to pay for her flowers and photographer, that this wasn't about ruining her day, but not dying for it. Vanessa shook her head, saying I was exaggerating again, that I was making everything dramatic for attention. The disconnect was total. She genuinely couldn't see reality anymore, couldn't process that medical professionals testified I'd likely develop kidney failure without consistent dialysis. She'd chosen to believe I was lying rather than accept her wedding was funded by my health. I realized I couldn't make her understand because she didn't want to, because understanding required acknowledging our parents loved her more, and she'd benefited from that inequality forever. About 5 weeks after the ruling, Dad asked if we could talk, his voice tired rather than angry. He said he'd been seeing a therapist who'd asked him questions about my childhood he'd never thought to ask himself. Dad said he'd gone through old photos and calendars and realized he couldn't remember attending my school events or asking about my diabetes or spending one-on-one time with me beyond emergencies. He'd found the Berkeley acceptance letter in a garage box, still in its envelope, with my note begging them to let me attend. He hadn't remembered receiving it, had no memory of refusing because he'd been so focused on Vanessa's modeling that my academic achievements hadn't registered as important. His voice cracked, admitting the therapist used the word neglect to describe his parenting of me. He'd gotten angry and defensive until she asked him to list 10 facts about my life compared to Vanessa's. He could name Vanessa's favorite food, friends, agencies, goals, fears, hobbies, while struggling to remember basic details about me beyond good at math and has diabetes. Dad said he'd spent 17 years believing he treated us equally while functionally erasing me, that he'd convinced himself I was independent and fine while really I'd just learned to survive without expecting help. He looked at me with tears and said he was sorry. That sorry wasn't remotely enough, but it was where he had to start, that he'd failed me in ways he was only beginning to understand. He asked if I could forgive him eventually, his voice breaking on, eventually, like he finally grasped some betrayals don't heal just because the betrayer feels remorseful. I told him I appreciated the apology but needed time, that 17 years of neglect couldn't be fixed by one conversation with a therapist. I said I'd consider rebuilding after I turned 18 and moved out, when there was distance and I didn't have to watch him prioritize Vanessa's wedding daily. He nodded, said he understood, that he'd respect whatever boundaries I needed. The conversation felt surreal because I'd waited my whole childhood for a parent to see me, and now that Dad finally did, I was too exhausted and hurt to care like I would have at 9 or 12 or 14. I turned 18 3 weeks after Vanessa's wedding and moved out the same day to a tiny studio near the hospital. My parents didn't try to stop me, didn't offer help with deposits, just accepted my departure with what seemed like relief. I spent my first night on an air mattress with my diabetes supplies organized in the bathroom and dialysis schedule on the fridge, feeling simultaneously free and terrified. My kidney function gradually improved with consistent treatment, eventually reaching the point where Dr. Okoye discussed possibly reducing sessions in the distant future if stability continued. The irony wasn't lost that what my parents wanted to force prematurely for financial convenience was now potentially possible through proper medical management. I'd been right to fight. I started community college classes, studying during dialysis, working at the coffee shop between, building education slowly because I couldn't afford full-time enrollment. It wasn't Berkeley or the university I'd imagined, but it was progress toward a degree I was earning entirely through my own effort. Now at 23, I work as a patient advocate at the same hospital where James once helped me, using my experience to help other young people navigate medical systems and family conflicts endangering their health. I meet teenagers whose parents deny them treatment or refuse medications or prioritize siblings' wants over their medical needs, and I recognize myself in their fear. I teach them to document everything, speak to social workers, understand their rights. I sit with them during difficult conversations and help them find courage to fight when nobody else will. The work pays barely above minimum wage, but matters in ways nothing else has. Every kid I help is another chance to change an outcome, to prevent the crisis that happens when parents make dangerous medical decisions. I maintain almost no contact with my family beyond annual cards with generic messages and photos of Vanessa's daughter. I don't hate them anymore, don't carry active anger. I've moved past rage into acceptance that they are who they always were, that their favoritism wasn't about my inadequacy, but their inability to love more than one child fully. Dad sends occasional emails updating me on family news, still in therapy, still hoping I'll eventually decide he's done enough growth to deserve forgiveness. I read them and rarely respond, not from cruelty, but because I genuinely don't have space for rebuilding with someone who spent 17 years showing I didn't matter. Maybe someday, decades from now, when wounds are scarred enough to touch without bleeding. But I'm not there yet, and that's okay because healing doesn't require reconciliation with people who hurt you, only acceptance the hurt happened and determination to build something better. I chose to live when my parents were willing to let me die for a party, and that choice reverberates through everything now. Every patient I advocate for, every teenager I help find courage, every day I wake with functioning kidneys that almost failed because wedding flowers mattered more than my survival. My parents chose Vanessa's wedding over my kidneys, and I chose my survival over their authority, and living with those choices means accepting some families break in ways that don't repair, that sometimes the only way forward is forward alone. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.